Hello, can you hear me, sort of?
Hello.
Hello, how is it going?
Okay, how you doing?
Doing good.
Oh, sorry, my microphone was hard muted.
Ha, making double sure no secrets shall be spilled.
Now the torch is on the hands of Sir Tash about audio issues.
Uh,
You hear me, right?
Sorry?
You can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can now. Yeah,
Because I said hi to you earlier. I guess you didn't
I
hear.
couldn't hear you earlier. Yeah.
that's the worst when you're like, everyone's ignoring me. Like, no, just can't hear you. Um, February 19th. I was just looking at the issue that was linked.
Hello.
So, no new audience today. Sad.
So who added the default value?
I did. Yeah, we marked it for 318, and I think we discussed two solutions in the past. Like one is patching it upstream, or another one is just adding a logic in gatekeeper to be the kind to wait for the kind to become available and then create VAP resources. It's 318 is due on October 31st, so I was wanting to like initiate the rediscuss the thing that what do we want to do about this, and do we want to do gatekeeper patch or upstream patch basically.
Now, remind me the uh, VAP generation stuff, we have already changed things so that it's running on a singleton pod. Is that right?
uh, I am not sure, let me verify.
I think we said we might need to do both, the fix on KK and add like a sleep or something in the gatekeeper set.
Well, I think we'll need a sleep no matter what, because there's going to be a race condition no matter what.
Yep, that's why we said like I think we need to do both basically.
Yeah, like the KK thing, and stop me if I'm wrong here, the goal is to reduce the race condition, not eliminate it. Like they're like 30 seconds is too long, but the discussion wasn't any amount of time is too long.
Did you hear back from the KK folks, Rita?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, do you just want to implement a fix in Gatekeeper set?
Yeah.
Did we have an answer for the singleton pod thing? Because I think that's related to the viability of a fix in Gatekeeper.
I'm looking it up.
Okay.
Sorry, can you remind me what the singleton pod discussion was about?
Only have a single pod, a single Gatekeeper pod do the generation of VAP resources.
Mm.
The reason why I think that's necessary is that whenever you have like a clock type thing, like we could probably get away without doing it, but it's a more complex task and we should do singleton pod anyway. But whenever you have anything that's like timestamp based, right? Time skew, clock skew becomes a concern.
I guess today, the controller is running, the gatekeeper controller is spread out, right? So it's not singleton.
I'm trying to see if constraint controller and constraint template control is only added as audit dependency or is it added as webhook dependency as well?
Well, the controllers themselves would definitely be a webhook dependency because we need to listen for constraints. The question is the writing of stuff. So there's a couple of overhauls that we probably should do. One with regard to singleton controllers. One is with constraint templates and the fact that constraint templates generate CRDs. That should probably be a singleton because that avoids like code skew due to rollouts. You know, there is a risk of like a controller fight amongst different versions of Gatekeeper controllers. But the main thing here is at some point we were going to gate VAP resource generation under an operation so that users could control which pod resource generation occurred on, and we were going to make it a singleton pod in our deployments.
Yeah, that is not there today.
Okay. Okay, so that
It just happens in the same controller that watches CT and constraints.
right, and that will always be true, I think, but we could add more flags to the controller
Sure.
code that basically like
Yeah,
check
but
out.
nothing is doing that today. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
So it sounds like that's a block or like that's part of the implementation, right? For adding a delay.
Yeah, and maybe we could like kill multiple birds with one stone here. Like maybe, and I'm not in love with this name for the operation, but if we had like a generator operation just globally that controlled, oh, if I see this, I generate a constraint template. If I see this, I generate a VAP binding. If I see this, I generate blah, blah, blah. If that was a universal operation, that could streamline things because I think this should be true universally, right? Whenever that we have this kind of behavior.
Here's a dumb question. How do we ensure only one controller exists for a operation?
We use operation flags, right? So that's how we have the audit running in a singleton pod is we have a separate deployment for audit.
Sure, but what is the thing that validates only one pod has that operation?
Oh, we don't validate it. In fact, we
Right.
probably can't and shouldn't validate it, right? Because that gets into eventual consistency concerns, right? Like that's just a property of the system that people deploying Gatekeeper need to know about. Now, like in our manifest, And in our Helm chart, that property holds, right? So it's not like the average user needs to be aware of this. It is people who take it upon themselves to like customize Gatekeeper at the infrastructure level, right? At which point I think it's fine for you to know, like we should provide guidance on how to do it, obviously, but like it's fine to put that burden on them to know that certain operations have certain platform requirements.
Yeah.
There is an edge case. I'm not sure how we handle it currently in the audit pod. Like if we upgrade the deployment, what's the order of operations for the deployment upgrade? Like you can take down the existing pod and then spin up a new pod, or you could spin up a new pod and take down the pre-existing. And I'm not sure which is the default behavior and which one we're using, but
Are you talking about the disruption budget stuff or?
no, it's literally like how do you handle upgrades? It's like a strategy, I think is the word they use for it, like an upgrade strategy.
Yeah. Let me see. I think today we just,
It should be under deployment, right? Like
yeah.
I don't see anything.
I
Yeah, I
don't
think we're
remember
just using the
seeing this.
default. I just forget what the default is.
Yeah, I think somebody added it. Uh, hmm. Oh, I typo. Yeah, so there is a rolling update on the controller manager. Let me check the audit. Yeah, audit doesn't have upgrade strategy because it's just one.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean that actually doesn't matter. It's more uh like so the number of replicas, that's like the ideal end state, and that just mathematically can't be true if you're ever doing updates, right? You're either going to exceed the number of replicas or you're going to be less than the number of replicas, depending on the strategy you use of do you spin up the new thing before you take down the old thing, or do you take down the old thing, then spin up the new thing? And different systems have different ideal answers as to what to do. And so deployment lets you choose that strategy, right? So either we go 1-2-1 or we go 1-0-1. Ideally, we should go 1-0-1, I think. But I forget what the default is.
Hmm. Well, anyway, the chart has rolling updates as the strategy type.
All right. I mean, it's just something to look at. Like, obviously, it's like a limited time frame that you have the multiple pods, and it doesn't appear to have caused operational issues. So it's sort of getting into the weeds. It's just a theoretically correct way of doing things.
Um, I think it's more of a concern for this VAP generation controller because it, well, but then there is eventual consistency. So if you miss it, it would, the reconciler will hopefully catch the problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a theoretical issue around clock skew, where you can imagine, let's say a user says, I want there to be like a 30-second delay before we fail closed in VAP. Now, let's imagine one of the nodes has a clock that's ahead in time by 30 seconds, right? And so the solution probably is going to be, we're going to like have a create after timestamp or something like that, right? And so if the node that thinks it's 30 seconds, oh, sorry, 30, it thinks it's 30 seconds in the past, not in the future, right? So this node that thinks it's 30 seconds in the past, it's going to say create after, and it's actually going to add 30 seconds to its old timestamp. And so it's actually going to put the current time in, right? And so if you have a second pod that then reads that timestamp, it's going to go, oh, perfect, we're done. It's been 30 seconds, time to create the thing. You know, and we could like start to think about, well, what happens, like even if with rollouts, it's possible to schedule on a different node and time skew, but there we're really like getting into low likelihood, like a bunch of things need to happen in the interim to get into that state. And we should remind ourselves it is a self-healing state. Like the K8s API server will eventually stop sending errors. We just don't want to need to be in a state where we're always vulnerable to clock skew. And that's why singleton, I think, is particularly important for doing things like adding delays to operations.
But wouldn't the solution be, instead of adding the delay, we would just in each controller just check if the CRD is available or not and then create VAP?
You could do like check if the, oh, I see what you're saying. It's possible. I, to be honest, haven't dug into the CRD internals or what the actual like issue with this, you know, the details of how this issue occurs. My concern with that would be, because Kubernetes control plane runs in a multi-headed fashion, right? Or can run, meaning you can have more than one control plane server if you're running in multiple regions. The status on the CRD, they don't have anything like bipod status, right? So you don't have the full visibility as to what all Kubernetes API servers think about the state of the CRD, right? So it may be fine to read the status. I don't know, like maybe they have a gossiping protocol underneath it. Maybe like just going off of CRD status renders the problem unlikely enough that we could get away with it. But the other strategy is the like quote unquote dumb strategy of just put in some delay time, right? The delay time has maybe an advantage of being user configurable and pretty simple to understand. But I'm definitely not against considering the going off of other signals like status. We would just need to have an understanding of the, as I said, the details of the problem to know if that's actually a fix or if that's just a somewhat mitigation, and a manual delay could do better.
To clarify, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was asking about like what the upstream issue is basically that when we apply the constraint template, the constraint kind is not available. So hence we face an error in VAP because VAP has this paramref field that refers to the kind that we are hoping that will be generated, and that is the issue. So wouldn't waiting for that kind to be available solve the issue before we
Well,
generate.
so the problem, this is a fundamental problem with observability, is just because one part of the K8s API server says that the kind is available, that actually doesn't mean that the whole API server agrees. Even if we're looking at just the single API server, right? Unless they have a global shared cache, if they have watches, right? If the different components of the API server have different watches and different controllers performing the ingestion, right? Or if they're waiting on the REST mapper or whatever to receive the update. It could be true that the component doing the reporting, meaning the one that's updating the status on the constraint template, is out of sync with the component that VAP relies on in order to not throw errors. And if that's the case, then we've probably mitigated the problem, right? Because there will be some delay before the status is updated, right? So it will be less likely that we'll receive the updates out of sync, but we still remain like potentially subject to the problem. And then when we think about multiple API servers, right? Like, so let's say you're running 3 separate API servers, the problem compounds itself, right? Because the possibility of addressing the problem at a code level with like a shared cache goes out the window. So that's where I'd say, without knowing the details, without knowing the details, I don't know. What were you saying?
Oh, I was just gonna say this remember this happened when we were testing the VAP and VAP binding generation. And even though we added like in the test script, right, I will say, hey, make sure you only run this when the the gatekeepers CRDs exist. We checked that, but it would still have this VAP binding problem because of that. This bug is because it has its own like informer cache, right? Like I think the cache, the API server cache, we can't control that. So even though our test script says, hey, I see this custom resource, it already exists, but whatever the API server is using for the VAP binding like execution, that is still doesn't see the custom resource for some reason. That's my understanding. So even if in Gatekeeper's code we check that, I still see the bug.
So a time, and it could be we use both, right? We could have a time delay and wait for the CRD
Oh
acknowledgement.
yeah. I figured that's what we were doing, right? Is wait for this, do some static time delay, and also check if the CR exists. But my point is today, even if we check the CR exists, without a time delay, we still hit the bug.
Yeah.
Is this I mean, this might be a dumb question, but is this error reported back to VAP object that this param kind does not exist in the cluster?
I'm guessing no. Like I've kind of like paid a bit less attention to the state of VAP lately, but last I looked, they didn't have any status reporting on the object whatsoever.
But probably good to validate. I mean, who knows, right? The latest may, but yeah, the status thing isn't the best.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, Even if it had the status, it will show on binding, and as soon as binding is there, you get blocked. If we were to write the status, like if I were to write the status, I will write it to the binding, right? And
Yeah.
as long as the binding exists, users will get blocked.
Hmm.
Um, so what's this magic delay we want to put in?
Yeah, so here's my naive sort of thought is that we have a singleton controller, because again, clock skew, that does the generation. And when it first notices a constraint template, right? Because the constraint template is the thing that creates the CRD, and that's where the problem is. It puts a timestamp saying like, hey, I saw this constraint template. And that timestamp could either be a create after timestamp or a this is when I observed the thing timestamp, and the delay is hard coded. Doesn't actually matter. Point is timestamp on the status of the constraint template, and then it just reschedules the reconcile, right? Because you could do that as a controller. You could say put this back in the work queue with a delay, and then the next
For
time
the
it comes
binding,
in,
right?
what's up?
For the binding, for that binding. Reschedule for the binding.
Exactly. Yeah. So the constraint template, the timestamp should be on the constraint template, but the binding controller, you're correct, or the probably the constraint controller, because that's the thing that generates the binding. That's the one that needs to do this like
Hmm?
time check and rescheduling and all that. And
If,
basically, good.
sorry, finish.
Once the appropriate time has passed, we either create the binding, or maybe what happens is we create the binding immediately, but with a fail open, and then we update the binding to fail close with the idea that we do as much enforcement as possible, but then update to close the loophole of the potential of errors, allowing resources to pass through once it makes sense.
Okay. So the timestamp for create after on the CT status, that wouldn't that be on the non-singleton controller? So
Well, so this is why the creation stuff should all be like in a singleton pod, is to make sure it's on a host name that's running the same clock, or a host that where all the controllers share the same clock. And no, I would put that in the singleton controller, right? Like, so the singleton controller, the operation, that's where I had this idea of like generation or whatever the
I
appropriate
see.
name is, being the operation gate. Because all pods should be running a constraint template controller, unless you have like a singleton mutation pod or something. But only certain pods, only one pod to be specific, should that constraint template controller do the generation process of creating a CRD. Only that singleton pod should be adding this timestamp, and only that same singleton pod should the constraint controllers be creating the binding, right? So if we have just this one operation, it's very easy to make sure that all of those operations are correlated onto the same pod, and because there's no other way to configure it, and it's a little easier to explain to operators who want to customize their footprint, right? When we update our description, because there's a page in the gatekeeper documentation describing the different operations, when we add this operation, we could say, yeah, run this as a singleton.
Then are we at risk of, like, let's say if the singleton pod goes down, are we at risk of not being able to generate uh, constraints kind, even though templates exist there or templates are being deployed?
Technically, yes, but one, the availability model of controllers kind of that's the intent, right? Controllers are meant to be able to withstand a bit longer downtime than say a webhook, right? Which needs to always be available because you don't know when it's going to get another request. contrast that with the controller, it just needs to observe the state of the API server and reconcile things in a time window that is acceptable to people. So in this world where a pod goes down, let's say the node gets scheduled for updating or whatever, so all the pods get evicted, the deployment controller, or more properly the replica set controller, is going to reschedule the pod, right? So there will be downtime, but it's more downtime than would be tolerable for a webhook, but hopefully not for a controller. I mean, there's edge cases you could think of, right, where like there's not enough, there's no node on which the pod could be scheduled. Maybe readiness is really slow for some reason. Maybe that's a concern, and maybe that should be addressed at some point. But the mere sort of possibility that you can have 0 pods at any instant in time, that's not a concern.
So to clarify, we are decoupling constraint generation, VAP generation, right? My understanding is the singleton just handles VAP binding generation, not
Well,
constraint generation.
uh, I think ideally we do both as singletons. Like right now, Gatekeeper, like I think it was a design mistake to have every single pod generate constraint templates. Like it, or every single pod generate the CRDs for constraint templates. Mostly it hasn't mattered because mostly we don't update that CRD generation code. But you can imagine, like, let's say you're running, what, 6 pods or something like that. If all of those pods that run constraint template controllers try to generate the CRD, if we have codes where not every pod agrees on what that CRD should look like, right? Because there's version skew, then those controllers are going to fight each other. So you're going to have some instability in the shape of the CRD, and you're going to have a spike in requests to the K8s API server in the period where there is a in progress rollout for Gatekeeper. Contrast that with a singleton pod. And one, we could provide pretty explicit instructions, right? Because we aim for backwards compatibility, we could say when you do a Gatekeeper update, if you're concerned about it, the singleton pod gets upgraded first. That makes sure that the CRD always has all the fields that you need. And 2, we don't get that potential of a, I don't think it would be a request storm that would bring down the API server because we've never seen that issue, but it is a spike in requests and it's unnecessary.
So you're actually suggesting, so the only thing that is not the singleton anymore is the CT generation. Sorry, CT controller.
Well, okay, so
I feel like the scope just keeps growing.
I mean, I think the scope of the discussion is growing. The scope of the work is not. This is actually like a very small bit of work, right? This is introduce an operation, and the rest of this is just if statements,
Okay.
right? So right now, we run the constraint and constraint template controllers on every pod that has an interest in knowing about constraints and constraint templates, right? So that's webhook and audit, and then, well, really open source only has 2 deployments, so webhook and audit deployments. And that's good, right? That means that the constraint framework gets populated, policies get evaluated, and CRDs get created, all of that. So the controllers themselves continue to be everywhere, right? Those operations don't change. What does change is we add a new operation, call it resource generator or resource generation or whatever. That operation flag gets added to the audit deployment. As far as code changes go, inside of the constraint controller and inside of the constraint template controller, wherever we have code that says, read this object, call the K8s API server, create this other object, unless it's the status object, because that's unique to the pod, we just wrap that in an if statement, right? We say if operation create object. And then as far as the timestamp stuff, that needs to be added, right? But that was always the case, right? Because that's the thing we're really looking to address.
Got it. So the singleton is doing all resource generation, not just VAP generation. Okay, that's what I mean by like because we started this conversation with VAP generation, right? But sounds like we're also doing it for all resource generation.
I mean, that's the end state I would like to see. It's not that we need to block having this out there on it. I just think that we're looking at 6 lines of code to add the other thing. So why not? If that's not true, then let's decouple them.
Well, just for clarity, today the Helm chart has 3 replicas for the controller manager.
Right. Yeah. I was speaking in deployments, right? Because that's the
Well, but they're like again defaults, right? Let's say there are 3 controller manager pods, right? So they are actually fighting today, I guess.
well, they are not fighting because the pods almost never disagree on the shape of the resource.
Mm-hmm.
We would need to either update our CRD shape that we want to have, which we do from time to time. It's just not a super common thing that we do. Or we would need to have upgraded some like library code, probably some core K8s thing that adds a field to the CRD resource, right? And then you would get a controller fight. And that controller fight would only happen for the duration of the upgrade. That's why it hasn't been like a burning issue, and probably why we haven't seen many problems around it. Is it just doesn't happen very often. But it just, if we're doing this singleton thing anyway, may as well clean it up.
Sure. Okay.
So what's the magical delay that we want to put
Yeah.
What's that?
We didn't get back to that.
in? What's the delay that we agree on that we
Yeah, how
want?
many seconds?
Well, it should be user configurable. And I think we just want it long enough that the likelihood that we run into the K8s bug is low. And I
What's
think we
the
want...
magic default, I guess?
Right. Well, I could tell you the criteria. I couldn't give you the actual number. Right. The criteria is that the likelihood we hit the K8s bug is low. Right. And that's a property of K8s, right? Like, how long do we need to wait before Kubernetes is fine? Sounds like 30 seconds from the issue, but I don't know like how robust that number is.
Could we make it like dynamic? Like we calculate based on whatever information. I don't know. This is just me thinking out loud.
Well, I think, as I said, user configurable, right?
Right.
Because if a user is like, oh no, my clusters are super like over resourced and there's like no delay, why are you making me wait? Yeah,
No,
Like
I was saying like instead of like
Yeah,
hard coding from a value, say like 30.
programmatically determine it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty hard because we don't know what the API server informer cache has. That's
yeah,
pretty.
like I could imagine doing this. I'm not suggesting we do this, but you could create basically a prober that consistently, like, it creates a CRD and it creates a binding and it like keeps pinging until it stops
Oh,
rejecting and records the time. And you like add a second or two to that. Like theoretically, you could do that, but like, one, how representative of the actual problem is it, right? Is it slightly lumpy and there's like just two clock cycles and sometimes they're more in sync and other times not, you know? Like, two, it's a lot of work and there's still a little bit of a guessing game, right? Because you're going to want to add some buffer. So why not just let the user specify buffer and see if that's good enough?
and whatever hack you do for detection or polling, you could hit a different API server.
Hmm, that's fair. Yeah.
It can also
Um,
change, right? Like today it's great, but tomorrow the cluster is overloaded and then it changes.
right. Well, that's why you wanted it dynamic. I was assuming.
I'm saying dynamic doesn't work because there are different API servers. So whatever hack we do, you can't guarantee that you're hitting the same API server.
Yeah.
And because it's an API server cache, we don't know. So
Right.
all we know is maximum is 30 seconds. So,
Then,
But
huh?
then delaying binding generation or VAP generation for every constraint to 30 seconds is also.
so okay, so this is key. It is not every constraint all the time. The problem only crops up with a novel CRD, and
Yeah.
this is why we attach it to the template, right? And so it is just for fresh templates. If someone creates a template, waits a day, and creates a constraint, that generation should happen immediately.
Well, that's what the timestamp, the created after timestamp thing is. As long as it's past that time, we don't need to wait at all. Yeah, I like it. Because the default value, let's just say we default to 30 because we know it, right? That that's the worst case, right? And it's just for that first one. Yeah. By the way, I've been taking notes.
Thank you.
I like how we're designing this whole thing just on this call. Okay, that will do.
I mean, it's not like it's an involved design in the sense that it's like distributed systems discussion, blah blah blah. But it's not like a super complex.
Well, you're kind of cheating by making a singleton, just saying.
That is not cheating. That is valid design. Like, I don't know. Are you cheating when you're doing like consistent hashing to distribute load to specific pods, right? So that this one pod handles like all requests for these things, and then maybe has some followers. Like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff where even when you're operating in orchestration, right, like across many nodes, you still need to at times make sure that one pod, one unit of computing handles all of a thing for a certain data set in order to avoid uh, uh, what's like wow, I lost my words, but spread, right? It's the cap theorem, right?
I'm just writing notes because I'm not gonna remember any of this later. Uh,
First VAP, right? Or VAPB?
VAPB. This only it we don't VAP is fine. It's the binding. Because once the binding is in the cluster, your new request will get blocked.
param ref is param kind is on binding. Okay.
Sorry, which one?
Uh,
Oh, yes. Because
that's
we
on.
are
I
still.
always I get confused about where it belongs to, and that's where the issue is. So yeah, makes sense.
I
Well,
think param kind is on the definition, but the specific param resource is on the binding.
let me just double check. You got me all worried. This is what happens when you don't touch this stuff in a while. I'm speaking for myself.
No, you're speaking for me too.
Yeah, param kind is on the VAP,
Okay, good.
and then the param ref is on the
Binding.
bind. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So we need to wait for 30 seconds for VAP to get generated.
Yes.
For the binding to get generated. The policy can get generated whenever. I keep calling it a definition because like calling it a policy kind of gets confusing. Right? Like
So
how
basically, the constraint goes through the constraints controller, right? Reconcile loop, right? When that happens, if you see a VAP B needs to get generated, wait. Only for the first one. Oh, sorry. Only if the create after timestamp is in the future.
Sleep 30.
What a mess. How do other people deal with this?
It's a
honestly
very
kind of
edge
the
case.
same way.
Huh?
I
Yeah.
was just saying this is like a very edge case because of the way our stuff is working.
Yeah. Because of the
Well,
custom resource, yeah.
I mean, no, there's distributed systems problems like this where you kind of coordinate based off of timestamps. There's other systems where, like Redis, for instance, one of the appeals of it was that the inbound requests were all sequential, so you could use it as like a global lock. What are some other schemes that I've seen? Gossiping protocols, right? Where like all of the pods responsible or all of the machines responsible for making a change need to like agree that the change has been made before it's like successfully done. And they all have their downsides. Like, sorry, I went right back to the CAP theorem because that's what this is. It's like a distributed database problem.
Any other topics? Are you unblocked, Jay?
Yeah, I didn't start work on this one, but I'll just wrap it up.
Okay. How's um the what was it? Exporter interface stuff coming?
Yeah, me and Max talked about it last one, and I'm gonna update I updated some of it, but I still need to touch up on few updates for on the design doc, and then I'll share it again before our next community meeting so people can look at it, and then we can discuss.
Do you need more reviews there?
Uh, Let me update it before EOD or like tomorrow afternoon, and then I'll ping and you guys can look at it.
Okay.
Because it's kind of outdated right now.
Okay.
Cool. Do we in the next meeting want to look at the milestone board again for 318?
I'm looking at it right now.
Okay.
Uh,
Do we want to do a triage? We don't have time.
9 minutes. Go. Just kidding. Mm.
Because I was looking at the board, and other than that mutation, uh, the issue related to map is the one that might need the most work, I think.
Just to bring that clock skew question to an end, and I'm not necessarily suggesting we do this, but the other thing that you could do is to set a flag saying like condition met, and that guards against clock skew across reschedules somewhat. Like you're still vulnerable to clock skew while you're waiting for the condition to be met. But if you happen to be rescheduled on a pod that thinks it's 10 years in the past,
Mhm.
that's not going to be an issue.
Actually, I like that. Because in theory, it's just one time, right? It's just a flag. Well,
Yeah.
I don't really care about the timestamp. By the way, there was a user that asked about mutation stuff again. I think I was asking on Slack if, let me paste the link here. Delete functionality. Is that also something we want to punt to map the entry one?
Delete
I
with mutation?
Yeah. I put it in the chat. Sorry, I'll put it in the chat and the meeting notes.
I I think it's more a matter of prioritization. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember right, theoretically, and maybe I'm also I haven't read the bug. I'm just inferring that it's delete a field. Uh, that
Oh, yeah, because I think, let me double check. I think this is
Yeah.
one where ability to remove keys from an object. And you actually said that should be added to a sign, but this was 2022.
Yeah, so I think there's no like theoretical reason not to add it, right? Like it's not going to conflict with external data or convergence, any of that stuff. I think that's just a prioritization issue.
Right.
Uh, yeah,
So I
I
just
think
want to confirm, is this something we are like theoretically are we okay with doing it? It's just time like when is the question versus no, it's not something we want to support at all.
if past Max said that it like does not affect convergence, I will trust him. If past Max said I need to think a little bit, but it seems fine, we should probably do that due diligence.
Past Max said it could be a conversion issue if it's not deleting the whole thing.
Yeah, but I thought we did the modify set just for this behavior.
I think,
Past Max also said, does modify set work for you? I know specifically we talked about the modify set for this feature.
Um,
Delete certain values and
yeah,
state.
so I think
they only remove values. Yeah.
Yeah.
there were two discussion, like was one was removing values from an array and one was removing values from a keyed array. And I think this request is for keyed array.
Yeah.
I could
Specifically, like
definitely.
say remove CPU limit. That's not a value. That's a key, right?
Yeah, keyed arrays and object fields are basically the same thing. I could definitely see myself being more like fine with keyed arrays and object fields. Add remove from regular arrays, certainly not if it was indexed. This is where I would need to like read the bug to see exactly what we were talking about.
So regular array is already satisfied with modify set, right? Like modify set, you can modify regular array, and there are conditions. Uh,
Actually, Pastmax said, oh yeah, the ability to remove keys from an object should be added to a sign. Okay, so there we go. Clearly, I must have like thought through this at some point. I just didn't want to like, because I had that whole proof thing, and it's very easy to break convergence if you're just going off of your gut.
Right. So are you guys okay if I just comment in the issue that removing keys is something we are okay adding? It's just need to priorities.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Or they can contribute.
Yeah, I'll nudge, but Anything else? All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Uh,
I
Bye.
Right.